She thought her daughter-in-law was bringing her a simple cup of coffee, but something about the smell didn't feel right. So she quietly switched the mugs, and 30 minutes later, her daughter-in-law collapsed on the floor. What came next unraveled years of trust, nearly cost her everything, and revealed a plan so calculated even her own son refused to believe it. My name is Margaret. I'm 65 years old, and this is the story of how I almost lost my home, my family, and my dignity, all because I trusted the wrong person. I used to think there was no greater joy in life than the sound of a baby's laughter filling a quiet home, the soft creak of the rocking chair on the porch, and the sweet smell of fresh banana bread baking in the oven while birds chirped just outside my window. My name is Margaret, though most people call me Maggie, and at 65 I didn't mind being called Grandma more than my real name, especially when it came from the tiny voice of my precious granddaughter, Emily. She had this way of saying it like it was a secret between us, something magical only she and I could understand. My days weren't filled with adventures or grand achievements, but they were rich in the quiet, golden details of a life well loved. Mornings began with black coffee and knitting, afternoons with tending my little garden of lavender and tomatoes, and evenings with family dinners that I still insisted on cooking, no matter how many times my son and his wife said I didn't have to. I didn't want thanks. I just wanted to feel needed, included, useful in the house that once echoed with my late husband's laughter and the heavy steps of our only son running down the stairs for school. That house, built with calloused hands and a stubborn heart, held all my memories, all my love, all my strength, and it meant everything to me. My son Jacob had grown into a fine man, dependable, hardworking, and kind, though lately a little more distracted than usual, which I told myself was just the pressure of providing for a young family. He'd married a beautiful young woman named Lauren a few years back, a nurse with soft hands and a sharp mind, though something in her eyes always made me feel like I was being studied instead of seen. Still, I welcomed her into our home with open arms, as any mother would, folding her into our traditions, teaching her how to make the potato salad just right, and showing her which windows got the best breeze in summer. At first, it felt like we were all settling into something warm and steady, like a new rhythm was forming in the house, and I was just grateful not to be alone after losing my husband. Jacob had insisted we all live together until they saved enough to buy their own place, and I agreed without hesitation. The idea of little Emily growing up with her grandmother just a room away seemed like a blessing, not a burden. But looking back now, I see the early signs that something wasn't right. The small shifts in tone when Lauren would answer me, the way she took over certain spaces in the house like they already belonged to her, or how she'd sometimes whisper to Jacob when they thought I wasn't around. I brushed those feelings aside, not wanting to seem paranoid, reminding myself that every new family has bumps in the beginning. I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who couldn't let go or made trouble where there was none. So I smiled, offered help when it was needed, stayed out of the way when it wasn't, and told myself that love, like gardens, just needed patience, space, and sunlight. Of course, I didn't know then that I'd soon be tested in a way I never imagined, that the people I loved the most would start seeing me not as heart of the home, but as something standing in the way. And all it took to change everything was a single cup of coffee. At first, it was easy to ignore the little things, those moments that felt just slightly off but could be explained away with the wave of a tired hand or a busy schedule. Like the time Lauren forgot to tell me that Jacob and Emily wouldn't be home for dinner, and I sat at the table with the food getting cold, convincing myself they must have gotten caught up with errands, or maybe Emily fell asleep in the car and they didn't want to wake her. Though the way she later said she thought Jacob had told me made my heart sink a little deeper than I expected. Because it wasn't the forgetting that stung. It was the effortless way she brushed it off, as if I shouldn't have expected to be included in the first place. Slowly, those moments began to grow in number, like tiny cracks in the wall that start invisible, but widen with each day, until one morning you wake up and realize the light is slipping through in places it shouldn't. I'd noticed the way Lauren would close the door just a little faster when I walked by, or how she'd whisper into her phone in the laundry room with her back turned, stopping mid-sentence when I walked in, claiming it was nothing important, though the look in her eyes said otherwise, as if I'd interrupted a thought she wasn't ready to share. Then came the small but steady rearrangements around the house. The tea towels I'd folded a certain way for years now folded differently, the photos on the mantel moved to make space for newer ones without me in them, and my favorite garden gloves missing from the shed, only to be found later, tossed carelessly behind the bins like they no longer had a rightful place. One afternoon, I came into the kitchen to find Lauren standing by the spice cabinet with a pen and notepad, crossing off what I assumed was a grocery list, until I glanced over her shoulder and saw headings that didn't belong to any shopping run. Terms like property value, current market, and mother-in-law residence caught my eye in a single heartbeat that stretched far too long. But before I could ask, she quickly turned the paper over and mentioned she was planning a surprise birthday dinner for Jacob and was just brainstorming ideas, though the edge in her voice and the stiffness in her smile made it hard to believe that something as kind-hearted as a surprise party was all she was working on. Still, I kept silent, telling myself once again not to jump to conclusions, not to let suspicion take root where love was supposed to grow, because I had always believed that family, real family, could overcome anything if given enough grace and patience. But the uneasiness lingered like a faint scent in the room you can't quite place, something sour just beneath the surface of familiarity, and it followed me into my dreams, where I'd wake up unsure if the tension I felt was real or imagined, wondering if maybe I was just tired, maybe a little too sentimental, maybe too old-fashioned for this new world where traditions and respect seemed to be fading like old wallpaper in the hallway. And yet, every now and then, I'd catch Lauren watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression unreadable, not angry or cruel, but calculating in a way that made me feel suddenly very small in my own home, like a relic being studied before it's quietly packed away. It wasn't long before the conversations began to shift in tone, almost imperceptibly at first, like the subtle way a warm breeze can turn sharp without warning, and I noticed how Jacob, my sweet boy who once held my hand just to feel safe, started speaking to me with less warmth in his voice and more detachment in his eyes, as though he were repeating things he'd been told rather than things he truly believed, gently but firmly suggesting that perhaps I shouldn't exhaust myself doing so much around the house, that I deserved rest, that I should enjoy my time and leave the heavier responsibilities to them. And while on the surface it sounded like concern, there was an underlying current to those words that made something deep in my chest tighten, because I could feel the shift wasn't coming from him alone, but from Lauren's influence slowly weaving its way into his thoughts, shaping how he saw me, how he spoke to me, and perhaps even how he remembered me. At first, it was talk about my garden, that maybe it was too much work for me now and wouldn't it be better to scale it back, let someone else handle the upkeep, maybe even convert part of the yard into a play area for Emily. And when I gently protested, saying the garden gave me joy and purpose, I was met with kind smiles that didn't reach the eyes and quiet exchanges between them when they thought I wasn't watching. Then it turned into discussions about the house itself, how big it was, how much maintenance it required, how I could live a simpler, more comfortable life if I downsized or even looked into a retirement community where everything would be taken care of for me, spoken with honeyed tones and feigned concern, as if this idea had sprung from love instead of calculation. But I could see through the sweetness and into the cold practicality hiding just behind it, especially when Lauren brought me a folder one evening with pamphlets, floor plans, and cheerful brochures filled with smiling elderly people playing cards and painting in sunny common rooms, all while assuring me that no decision had to be made yet and they only wanted what was best for me, though everything in her voice told me she believed she already knew what that was. I thanked her politely and tucked the folder away in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, but I couldn't sleep that night, lying there with my thoughts tangled like old yarn, remembering how my husband and I had saved for decades to build this home, brick by brick, how we had chosen every window, every fixture, how our laughter had echoed through these walls, and how, even in his final days, he had made me promise to keep it safe. Not because of its value in money, but because of the life it contained, the history and heart poured into every corner. And now, to see that legacy slowly slipping through my fingers under the guise of care and simplifying, I felt not just threatened, but erased, like a book someone was gently trying to close before I had finished telling my story. Still, I said nothing directly, not yet, because part of me clung to hope that maybe this was just a phase, a misunderstanding, a misguided attempt at help, and that if I just held steady, kept smiling, and didn't make waves, things would return to the way they were, or at least something close enough to keep the peace. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I could feel the pressure building quietly around me, like the walls of my own home were inching inward with each passing day. And I began to realize that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who tighten the noose with the gentlest hands. That morning started like so many others before it, with the distant hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle, the soft shuffle of Emily's bare feet on the hardwood floor, and the light scent of toast wafting through the hallway. But something in the air felt slightly off. Not in a dramatic way, but in the sort of quiet wrongness that only becomes obvious when you look back and realize your body sensed it before your mind could name it. Like how a dog might tense before a storm, even though the sky is still blue. And when Lauren appeared in the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs in hand, one of them placed in front of me with an almost too perfect smile, I immediately noticed something that made my breath catch just slightly in my chest. It wasn't the look on her face, which was as calm and pleasant as ever, nor was it the tone of her voice, which floated through the kitchen like silk, but rather the smell rising from the cup she had placed before me. Because although I had been drinking the same coffee for years, a rich, smooth, medium roast that I always brewed myself, this particular cup carried a faintly chemical note that didn't belong, something bitter and strange lurking beneath the familiar aroma. And for a moment, I told myself it was just a new creamer, or maybe a change in brand, until I remembered I had restocked everything myself the week before, and nothing should have changed. Yet here it was, sitting in front of me, this oddly scented cup offered with such casual kindness it made my skin prickle beneath my sweater. And then, just as I was trying to steady my thoughts, Emily came running into the kitchen chasing her plush rabbit. And in one swift motion, her little foot caught the corner of the rug, sending her tumbling forward toward the edge of the table where my full cup sat waiting. And in that frozen instant, my only thought was to protect her. So I lunged forward, grabbing the cup just before it could topple over onto her, the hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to her tiny hands. And for a second, my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe because the image of that coffee spilling onto her skin twisted my stomach in a way that felt entirely too real, too possible. And when I looked up, Lauren was already there, scooping Emily into her arms with a flurry of concern and telling me everything was fine, no harm done, just a clumsy morning. But all I could think about was how my hand had trembled as I held the cup and how close I had come to drinking it just minutes before. Once the chaos settled and Emily was distracted with her cereal, Lauren gently slid the second mug toward herself and began to sip. But before rim touched her lips, I moved without thinking, casually reaching across the table and pretending to fix the salt shaker just long enough to switch the cups while she wasn't looking. And though my movement was smooth, practiced from decades of motherhood and instinct, my heart thudded so hard I could hear it in my ears because I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to happen. I only knew that something didn't feel right and that whatever was in that cup had no place inside my body. She didn't notice, or if she did, She said nothing, just sipped slowly with her eyes on her phone while I sat perfectly still, waiting, watching, listening for any sign that the strange feeling in my gut was anything more than just the byproduct of suspicion and sleeplessness. For 20 minutes, nothing happened, and I began to doubt myself again, wondering if I had become one of those women who see ghosts in tea leaves and villains in shadows. And just as I started to rise to refill the pot, Lauren stood suddenly and grabbed the edge of the counter, her face blanching in a way that drained the room of color. And for a brief, terrible moment, I thought she might collapse right there onto the floor with Emily only feet away. But she steadied herself, brushing off the dizziness with a tight smile, saying it must be low blood sugar or maybe a migraine coming on. Though I noticed the way her hand trembled as she set the cup down and how she avoided my gaze, her voice softer, slower, as if she were trying to convince herself of something even more than me. And then, just like that, it passed. She went upstairs to lie down. The moment dissolved into the day, leaving no scars or answers behind, only questions that twisted deeper into my chest with every tick of the clock, because whatever had just happened, it hadn't been nothing. But it hadn't been enough to prove anything either, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part of all. I remember staring at the digital clock on the oven as the minutes crawled by with an unnatural slowness, each tick echoing in my ears louder than the last, my hands busying themselves with wiping down an already clean counter, while my eyes kept flicking toward the staircase, half expecting to hear Lauren's footsteps at any moment, either returning with her usual brisk energy or perhaps calling down in that tight voice she used when she wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. Yet what came instead was silence, dense, oppressive, and far too long. And just as I was about to go check on her under the pretense of bringing a glass of water, I heard a faint thud from upstairs, not sharp or sudden, but the kind of dull, unsteady sound that told me something had given way, like a knee buckling or a shoulder catching the edge of a dresser, and my stomach dropped as I abandoned the cloth and climbed the stairs as fast as my legs would allow. At first I called out gently, trying not to startle Emily, who was still humming to herself in the kitchen with her cereal and crayons, and when no answer came, I pushed open the bedroom door to find Lauren sitting on the floor by the window, her back propped against the side of the bed, one hand limp in her lap, while the other clutched the edge of the comforter as though she had tried to pull herself up and failed, her face pale and damp with sweat, lips parted but not quite forming words, and though she looked at me, I could tell she wasn't fully present, like her mind was stuck between two places, one foot still in the room and the other drifting somewhere far more fragile. I didn't panic, I didn't cry. I simply moved, slow but steady, reaching for the phone and calling for help with the same calm precision I once used when Jacob had broken his arm falling from the swing set, because after a certain age, a woman learns that fear doesn't serve anyone in a crisis, that strength is quieter than most people think, and as I sat beside her, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven rhythm, I felt a strange mix of dread and clarity settle over me, as though something that had been tangled and knotted for months had just loosened enough for me to see the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to know that what I had felt was real, and that the danger I had sensed was not imagined, no matter how much I had tried to excuse it. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their voices brisk but professional. As they asked me questions, I answered carefully, measuring every word. Because while part of me wanted to say everything, to explain the smell of the coffee, the switched cups, the strange behavior, I also knew that timing was everything, and that speaking too soon without evidence or understanding might unravel what little I had managed to hold together. So I said only that she had seemed dizzy, that she wasn't herself this morning, and that I thought perhaps she needed rest, which wasn't a lie but also wasn't the full truth. And as they wheeled her out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask pressed to her face, I stood at the bottom of the stairs holding Emily close, her tiny fingers tangled in my shirt, her wide eyes asking questions her voice hadn't yet learned to form. Jacob came rushing in not long after, breathless and worried, his keys still in one hand, and when he saw Lauren being lifted into the ambulance, something inside him broke, right there on the front lawn in the morning sun, and I watched as fear swallowed his face. Not just fear for her, but the kind of fear that comes when you realize the world isn't as stable as you believed, that people you love can crumble without warning, and in that moment, all I could do was hold Emily tighter and keep my face calm, even as my heart raced with the knowledge that everything had shifted and there was no going back to before. I stood there long after the ambulance drove off, long after Jacob and Emily went inside, staring down the road and listening to the faint wind rustling through the trees, wondering what came next, knowing deep down that whatever this had been, whatever had nearly happened, it was only the beginning, and that I had just stepped into something far more dangerous and far more personal than I had ever prepared for. The house felt impossibly quiet after Lauren was taken to the hospital, not the kind of peaceful stillness that comes when everyone is sleeping or when the day winds down, but a tense, unnatural silence that seemed to press against the walls and fill the corners like fog. And though Jacob tried to move through the day as if things would return to normal soon, I could see the tremble in his hands when he picked up his coffee, the way he kept checking his phone for updates that never came quickly enough, and how his eyes darted to mine whenever I entered the room, searching for reassurance I didn't know how to give, because even though I wanted to comfort him, to hold him the way I had when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms, I knew deep down that comfort would be a lie, because something had been set in motion that could no longer be ignored or brushed aside with warm words and motherly hugs. Lauren remained in the hospital for observation, the doctors unsure what exactly had caused her episode, running tests and offering vague explanations. Maybe a sudden drop in blood pressure, maybe a reaction to something she ate, maybe a buildup of stress. But none of it rang true to me. And while I nodded politely on the phone and thanked them for their efforts, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't an accident, not a fluke or coincidence, but the result of something planned, something deliberate, and the knowledge that the cup she drank from was meant for me stirred something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not anger, but a deep, slow-burning resolve that told me it was time to stop waiting for answers to come to me and start finding them on my own. She didn't argue, didn't plead or protest. She simply packed a small suitcase, collected a few personal items from the bathroom, and walked out the front door without once looking back, her shoulders drawn tight and her expression unreadable, like someone leaving a job they had long since stopped enjoying but still hoped might one day be theirs again. Jacob said little in the days that followed, choosing instead to focus on Emily, taking her to school, brushing her hair, reading to her at night in a voice that cracked just slightly when he thought I wasn't listening. And while we didn't speak in depth about what had happened, I knew from the way he lingered in the hallway outside my room before bed, or how he asked me if I needed anything when I coughed softly in the kitchen, that the wall between us had begun to come down, slowly, quietly, brick by brick. I should have felt relief, maybe even triumph, but what settled over me instead was a strange kind of grief, not for Lauren, who had made her choices, but for what could have been, for the version of my family I had believed in, the one I thought we were building together, and it took me a few days to admit, even to myself, that part of me had wanted her to apologize, to explain, to cry and say she was sorry, not because I wanted her back, but because some small part of me still longed for understanding, for closure that never came. Instead, she vanished from our lives like mist in the morning sun, and Jacob filed for legal separation a week later, citing irreconcilable differences with a voice that didn't tremble, though his hands tightened slightly around the pen as he signed the papers. And just like that, it seemed, the threat was gone. The house was safe again, and I was no longer the target of quiet manipulation and whispered schemes. I resumed my routines, gardening, knitting, baking cookies for Emily's lunchbox. And though some part of me remained cautious, like a soldier returned from war who still checks the locks twice before bed, I allowed myself, for the first time in months, to exhale. People in town began to smile at me differently again, with warmth instead of pity, and Jacob started calling me Mom, with that same old affection that once made my heart melt during his teenage years. It felt, in many ways, like balance had returned. But what I didn't know, what none of us could have guessed, was that Lauren hadn't left empty-handed. She had taken something with her, something I hadn't noticed until it was too late. And that missing piece would change everything. It was almost 2 weeks after Lauren had left that the envelope arrived, slipped through the mail slot in the front door, and resting there among utility bills and grocery flyers, as if it were just another piece of the day, harmless and ordinary. But the moment I picked it up and saw the return address, a law office I didn't recognize in a neighboring city, I felt a faint chill crawl along the base of my neck, not because I expected danger, but because something about its timing, its anonymity, and its silence stirred an old instinct in me, the kind that once made me check twice when Jacob was out past curfew or stay up late waiting for my husband's headlights to appear in the driveway after a storm. I opened it slowly, carefully, and what I found inside turned the world upside down all over again. It was a formal letter, printed on thick paper, addressed not to me but to Jacob, though the cover note explained it had been sent in duplicate to ensure it reached him, and what followed was a claim filed by Lauren through her attorney, stating that she had been coerced into leaving the family home under emotional distress, that she had been denied rightful access to shared assets, and most shockingly, that she was in possession of a signed agreement, allegedly written and dated weeks before her hospitalization, stating that I had agreed to gift the house to Jacob and Lauren jointly as part of a long-term family arrangement. The shock of it nearly took the breath from my lungs, not because of the document itself, which I'd never seen and certainly never signed, but because of how cleverly it had been prepared, how the date matched the week I had been particularly ill and disoriented from the odd dizziness I now understood had been anything but accidental, and how the signature, though shaky and unfamiliar, bore enough resemblance to mine that a casual glance might pass it off as authentic. I sat down at the kitchen table, the light from the window falling across the letter like a spotlight, and I felt that coldness return, not the fear of being hurt, but the deeper, heavier fear of not being believed again, of being drawn back into a battle I thought I had already won, only to find that the opponent had never truly left the field. When Jacob came home later that afternoon and read the letter, his face turned pale, his mouth tightening in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child, trying not to cry after a scraped knee. And though he said nothing at first, I could see in his eyes the conflict beginning to rise again. The doubt, the worry, the terrible question of whether the woman he had loved could truly have done all this, or whether, maybe, just maybe, his mother had signed something and forgotten. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with a quiet ache, knowing that trust, once cracked, rarely heals cleanly, and that it wouldn't take much for those old shadows to return. What Lauren had done was brilliant in its cruelty, because even though the evidence I had shown him weeks earlier was still fresh in his memory, this new twist, this forged agreement, threw everything back into question. If she could produce a document that looked official, that bore a signature close enough to mine, and claim she had been driven from her home unjustly, then it was no longer just about betrayal. It became a legal war, one that could drag on for months, cost us everything, and leave Emily stuck in the middle of a storm she never asked for. And that, I realized with growing horror, was likely Lauren's true goal. Not to win, but to exhaust, to wear us down, to make us give up out of desperation just to make it stop. But what Lauren didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that I had been keeping something too. Something I hadn't shared with Jacob, not because I didn't trust him, but because I hadn't known if I would ever need it. It was a recording One made on my phone weeks before she left, on a morning when Lauren had been unusually talkative, her voice laced with sarcasm and overconfidence, speaking to someone on a call she had taken in the kitchen, not knowing I was in the next room behind the closed pantry door, and in her rush to make her point, she had admitted, clear as day, that I didn't know what I was signing, that it wouldn't matter anyway once the papers were filed, and that by the time Jacob figured it out, the house would already be theirs. I had saved that file, unsure why, thinking maybe it was just my paranoia again. But now, as I reached for the device tucked safely into the drawer beside the toaster, I knew with complete certainty that what she had tried to take from me, my peace, my home, my son, was about to slip through her fingers once and for all. I didn't rush. There was something almost sacred in the stillness of that moment as I sat at the kitchen table holding the phone that contained the final piece of truth, the one Lauren hadn't counted on, and I took my time listening to the recording again, just once. Before I called Jacob back into the room, my fingers calm, my voice even, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because I needed him to see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears the thing I had carried quietly for so long, the piece of the story that would finally bring everything into the light. He listened in silence, his face slowly shifting from tension to realization, and as the words played out, Lauren's voice, clear and confident, describing exactly how she had planned to use my confusion to get what she wanted. His hands clenched, his eyes narrowed, and when the audio stopped, there was nothing left to explain. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speak. He just reached for the forged letter still lying on the table, tore it cleanly in half, then again into quarters, and threw the pieces into the trash without ceremony, as if to say, "This ends now." But it didn't end there. Jacob, with the quiet strength I had almost forgotten he possessed, contacted his attorney that very week, not just to finalize the separation papers, but to open an investigation into the false property agreement, submitting the audio, the photographs, and the timeline I had compiled. He insisted that the forgery be addressed formally, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. Because even after everything, he still wanted to believe in accountability, in the law, in doing things the right way. And though I warned him that such a process could be long and difficult, he didn't waver. What I didn't know, what he hadn't told me until weeks later, was that he had also quietly filed a counterclaim, protecting the house not just in my name, but legally placing it in a trust under my sole stewardship, ensuring that no future manipulation or legal trick could ever threaten it again. Lauren, for her part, was not prepared for the strength of the response. She had expected guilt, delay, confusion, but not clarity, not evidence, not Jacob standing firmly beside me instead of in the middle. When she received notice that her document was under scrutiny for possible fraud, her tone changed. The calls began, not to me, but to Jacob, short, clipped messages asking to speak, to explain, to make things right. But he didn't answer. And when her lawyer realized the extent of what we held, the tone changed again, from aggressive to apologetic, from threats to quiet withdrawal. And within a month, the case was dismissed, her claim dissolved, and the agreement deemed invalid on all counts. I thought that would be the end of it, that with the house secured, the legal shadow lifted, and the door closed for good, peace might finally return. But life, as I had learned, has a way of surprising us even after the battle ends. It was a warm spring afternoon when I received an unexpected letter, not from a lawyer or investigator, but from a woman named Helen, who introduced herself as Lauren's aunt. She wrote kindly, without judgment, saying that though she hadn't seen Lauren in years, she'd recently received a panicked phone call from her, asking for money and a place to stay. And after some hesitation, Helen had agreed, but only briefly. She described how Lauren, in tears, admitted that she had lost everything, not just the house, but her job, her savings, and the trust of nearly everyone around her, all because, as she finally said aloud, she underestimated the old woman. Helen included something in the envelope, something I didn't expect, a photo, old and slightly worn, of Lauren holding Emily on her first birthday, standing beside me with a hesitant smile, the kind that, now in hindsight, seemed more like performance than connection, and scribbled on the back in ink just faded enough to be haunting was a single line. "I'm sorry. I really thought you'd never notice." I held that photo for a long time, not with bitterness or triumph, but with something quieter, like closure, or perhaps a soft kind of sorrow for what could have been had she chosen honesty instead of control. And when I finally tucked it into the drawer beside the binder that had once carried the weight of truth, I knew with absolute certainty that justice doesn't always come loudly or quickly, but it does come. Now, when I walk through my garden in the early morning light, the lavender brushing softly against my fingertips, I don't look over my shoulder. I don't listen for quiet footsteps or whispered conversations behind closed doors. I breathe deeply, move slowly, and smile at the sound of Emily's laughter echoing from inside the house that is still mine, not just by law, but by love, by memory, and by the quiet, unwavering strength that no one could ever take from me again. So I made a quiet call from the landline in the guest room, the one no one used anymore, dialing a number I'd kept tucked in the back of an old recipe book for years, a contact given to me long ago by a friend whose ex-husband had tried to take more than just the house when things fell apart. And while I'd never thought I'd need it, something about the look in Lauren's eyes that morning and the bitter scent of that coffee made me reach for it without hesitation. The man who answered spoke with the calm precision of someone who dealt in details, not drama. And though I didn't share everything at once, he listened carefully as I explained the situation in simple, measured terms, describing the recent changes in the house, the tension, the pressure to sign documents I hadn't fully read, and the cup of coffee that didn't smell like anything I'd ever brewed in my kitchen. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't gasp or speculate, just told me he'd look into it discreetly and get back to me soon, and that was all I needed to hear. In the meantime, I went about my days as normally as I could, caring for Emily while Jacob visited the hospital, cooking meals I barely tasted, folding laundry that no one noticed, all the while keeping my eyes open and my ears sharp, listening for anything that might confirm what I already suspected, that Lauren hadn't just grown tired of me or frustrated with sharing the house, but had seen me as an obstacle to something she wanted badly enough to remove me from the picture entirely, just not in a way that left a mess behind. And as I dusted the bookshelves or wiped down the counters, my mind kept circling back to that list I had glimpsed weeks ago, the one with words like market value and shared equity, and I began to wonder just how far she had gone in preparing for a future that didn't include me. 3 days later, I received a call while Jacob was out running errands, and the voice on the line was steady as he explained that Lauren had met with a real estate lawyer several times over the last month, inquiring about transferring property titles, exploring what could be done if a homeowner was no longer mentally sound, and even asking questions about durable power of attorney, terms that, on their own, might not raise suspicion, but taken together, painted a picture that chilled me to my core. More disturbing still, he told me there had been online purchases tied to her email account, unusual items like small medical kits, substances commonly used in care settings but difficult to obtain without a license, and most notably, a specific supplement that, when taken in small doses over time, could cause fatigue, confusion, and memory fog in older adults. Symptoms not unlike the ones I had been experiencing more frequently over the last few months but had chalked up to age or stress. He sent me the details in a secure file, and I printed them late that night after Jacob had gone to bed, reading each line slowly, my hands cold despite the warm tea beside me, because there, in black and white, was the quiet proof I had needed. Not enough to take to the authorities just yet, but enough to know I wasn't imagining things, that my instincts had been right, and that the woman I had welcomed into my home, into my family, had been carefully and quietly planning to take everything from me, my house, my peace, my role as grandmother, and maybe even more than that. And in that moment, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the soft hum of the refrigerator behind me and the moonlight spilling in through the window, I knew that the time for hoping things would get better had passed, and that if I didn't protect what was mine, no one else would. The next morning began like any other, with the kettle whistling softly and the house still dim in the early light. But inside me, everything had changed. Because once you see the truth written out so plainly, no amount of routine or habit can ever fully return you to the world you lived in before. And as I moved through the motions, setting the table, buttering toast, folding the blanket Emily had left crumpled on the couch, I felt like I was walking through a version of my life that looked the same on the outside, but had shifted irreversibly beneath the surface, like the ground had cracked and only I could see it. The call came shortly before lunch, just as Emily had settled down for her midday nap, and I stepped into the sunroom to answer it with the door closed and my voice steady, though my heart already knew that what I was about to hear would confirm every shadow that had crept into the corners of my mind these past few weeks. The investigator didn't waste time with pleasantries. He understood the weight of what he carried and delivered it with care, not drama, explaining that during his quiet digging, he had managed to uncover a conversation Lauren had recorded herself, stored as a voice memo on her cloud account and linked to a shared folder she had forgotten to lock down, a conversation between her and a woman I didn't recognize, possibly a friend or coworker. And though the audio was slightly muffled in places, the message came through with chilling clarity. She spoke of frustration, of being tired of waiting for things to change, of how difficult it was to move forward when the house still legally belonged to me, and how she didn't think Jacob would ever find the courage to push me out on his own. Then came the part that made my blood run cold, when she described how sometimes people lose their memory with age, how a little confusion could go a long way in convincing someone to sign things they didn't fully understand, and how, in her words, if she starts forgetting enough, the house won't even matter anymore. I sat there listening, not once blinking, as the words played in my ear like a story I couldn't believe was real, except that it was, and it came not from some enemy across the fence or stranger in the world, but from the very woman I had once taught how to make apple pie from scratch, the same woman I had held in my arms when Emily was born, whispering how proud I was that she had brought such a beautiful life into the world, never knowing that behind those quiet eyes was a mind calculating how to remove me from the picture without so much as a ripple. And if that weren't enough, the investigator had also found records of meetings between Lauren and the same lawyer I had seen listed on the brochures she gave me, as well as a draft agreement prepared in Jacob's name, assigning him sole ownership of the house pending my consent, documents that had never been presented to me but were waiting quietly in the background, as if all that was needed was a signature from a woman too tired or too confused to read between the lines. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even feel angry in the way I expected I might. Instead, I felt something deeper, a quiet steel settle into my spine, the kind of strength that comes not from rage, but from knowing exactly who you are and what you must do. Because now I had more than suspicion. I had proof, not just of intent, but of action, and that changed everything. No longer was I just a mother-in-law feeling pushed aside, or a grandmother being told she needed rest. I was a woman with the truth in her hands, and the choice of what to do with it lay squarely at my feet. And so I spent the rest of that day planning, not with vengeance in my heart or bitterness in my bones, but with clarity, with purpose, and with the quiet understanding that if someone was going to protect my home, my family, and the legacy my husband and I had built together over a lifetime, it had to be me. Because if I didn't act now, if I let fear or politeness stop me, there might come a day when I wouldn't recognize the house I lived in or the faces of those around me, And that, more than anything, was something I could never allow. There's a particular kind of ache that comes not from physical pain or even betrayal, but from the realization that the person you brought into the world with your own body, the child whose scraped knees you kissed and whose forehead you checked 100 times during every fever, now looks at you with doubt in his eyes, as if the years of unconditional love and sleepless nights somehow hold less weight than the soft suggestions whispered into his ear by someone who hasn't known him nearly as long. And that ache took root deep inside me the moment I finally tried to share a piece of what I'd discovered, thinking foolishly that surely Jacob would see the signs I now saw so clearly, that the voice memos and files, the hospital visit, the strange behavior, all of it would add up in his mind the way it had in mine. But instead, what I saw when I spoke to him was hesitation, the kind that isn't born from logic but from fear, the fear of having to confront something too, painful to accept. I didn't tell him everything, not yet, just enough to gently place a few pieces on the table, speaking carefully, not accusing anyone, not raising my voice, just asking questions, suggesting concerns, wondering aloud if he had ever noticed Lauren acting different, or perhaps mentioning things about the house, or maybe showing an unusual interest in my routines or health. But instead of leaning in with concern or curiosity, Jacob pulled away, not physically, but emotionally, the way people do when they're caught between two impossible choices and don't want to look too closely at either. And I could see it in the way his jaw tensed and his eyes moved to the floor, as though by avoiding my gaze he could delay the moment of truth a little longer. He said things I expected to hear, things about stress, about misunderstandings, about how Lauren had always been under pressure since Emily was born, how maybe I was overthinking, how people act differently when they're overwhelmed. And though he never once accused me of being wrong or unreasonable, the softness in his words stung more than anger ever could, because it meant he was trying to protect everyone at once, including me, by pretending nothing was wrong at all. And while part of me wanted to reach out, to take his hand and beg him to listen, to believe me, the other part knew that pushing too hard would only drive him further away, especially if the story he'd been told was one of a mother slipping slowly, gently into confusion, someone to be loved but not entirely trusted. So I nodded. I smiled. I said I understood, that maybe I had read too much into things, that perhaps I was just tired. And then I watched him exhale with relief, as if I had just untied a knot he hadn't known how to handle. And in that moment, I realized just how carefully Lauren had laid the groundwork, because it wasn't enough to isolate me physically. She had begun to isolate me emotionally, too, quietly planting seeds of doubt that made my son question not just my words, but my mind. That night, as I sat alone in my bedroom with the door quietly closed and the sounds of the house muffled beyond the walls, I felt a loneliness I hadn't known in decades, not because I was unloved, but because the love I had poured into my family had been slowly, carefully redirected, bent and shaped by someone who understood how to move without being seen. But even in that stillness, I did not feel defeated. No, what I felt was more like sorrow, deep and heavy, but also clarity, because now I understood that I would have to walk the next part of this path alone. Not because Jacob didn't love me, but because love sometimes isn't enough when trust has been quietly weakened over time. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't waste my energy trying to convince him of something he wasn't ready to see. I had to keep going, quietly and carefully, gathering every thread, every detail until the truth became something that couldn't be denied, not by anyone. There's a difference between suspicion and truth, a space so narrow it often feels like the two live side by side, brushing shoulders in the quiet corners of your mind. And I had lived in that space for weeks, balancing between what I feared and what I could prove, until one afternoon when the final thread snapped with such quiet finality that I almost didn't recognize the weight of it at first. The call came just after lunch, while Jacob had taken Emily to the park and the house sat still under the soft hum of the ceiling fan, and when I answered and heard the investigator's voice, I knew by his tone that something had shifted. What he had found wasn't just another receipt or phone record, not another whisper of intent or questionable message. It was visual, clear, and impossible to twist into anything else. And as he guided me through the secure folder he'd sent, the images on my screen began to tell a story far more damning than I had prepared myself to see. The first photo showed Lauren sitting across from a notary public at a small desk, documents spread out before her, and though she wasn't signing anything in that moment, the notary's stamp was already visible on the corner of one form, and beside her was a printed copy of what I quickly recognized as a property transfer agreement, my name at the top, Jacob's at the bottom, and in the margin a scribbled note in Lauren's handwriting that chilled me more than anything I'd seen so far, a short sentence that implied I had given verbal permission and simply hadn't been able to sign due to fatigue that day, which, if taken at face value, could serve as justification for moving forward without my actual consent. The second image showed her in a parking lot, standing beside that same notary, slipping a manila folder into her bag while talking into her phone, her face calm and unreadable. And finally, a video clip, brief, grainy, but undeniable, captured from a home security camera outside the office, showing her walking to her car with the folder tucked under her arm, pausing just long enough to speak into her phone, with a look of quiet satisfaction on her face that made my breath catch, because it wasn't the face of someone stressed or overwhelmed or unsure. It was the face of someone who believed they had already won. I sat in silence for a long time after the video ended, the cursor blinking on the screen like a heartbeat, steady and indifferent to the storm now unraveling inside me. And I realized then that the game Lauren had been playing wasn't just subtle, it was sophisticated, strategic, and built over time with careful precision, designed not to break me all at once, but to slowly move me out of place until one day I simply wasn't standing there anymore. But what she hadn't counted on was that I was still watching, still thinking, still holding on. Not just to my home, but to my mind, my clarity, and my refusal to let go of everything I had built without at least fighting to protect it. Now I had more than words. I had dates, images, names. I had proof that went beyond paranoia or suspicion, and with it came a calm resolve that settled over me like armor. Not cold or bitter, but steady, grounded, and prepared. I didn't know yet how I would use it or when, but I knew the moment was coming, and when it did, I would be ready. Not for revenge, not even for punishment, but for truth. Undeniable, unshakable truth that would no longer require explanation or justification. The kind of truth that speaks for itself. And as the late afternoon light spilled across the hardwood floors and the kettle began to whistle once again in the kitchen, I stood up, smoothed the hem of my blouse, and whispered quietly to no one in particular that the time for doubt had passed. From this moment forward, I would no longer wait to be believed. I would show them all. By the time the weekend came, I had spent 3 long evenings sitting alone at the dining room table, reviewing every detail of what I had gathered, organizing files, listening to the audio recordings over and over until I knew every pause, every inflection, every breath Lauren took as she spoke about me in a way that stripped away every illusion I had once held about who she really was. And though the weight of it all pressed heavily on my chest, it also sharpened my focus, narrowing my thoughts into something clear and deliberate, because I knew now that justice doesn't always arrive on its own. You have to lead it to the door and invite it in. The plan I had in mind wasn't dramatic or cruel. It didn't involve confrontation or public embarrassment, because that wasn't who I was and never had been. But it did require patience, timing, and the careful orchestration of a moment that couldn't be talked around or dismissed, one that would place truth right in front of the people who needed to see it most, particularly my son, who, for all his kindness and good intentions, still lived in a fog thickened by trust and love for a woman who had long since stopped earning it. I knew Lauren was due to return home the following week, and I also knew that Jacob, eager to smooth things over and return to some version of normal, would suggest a quiet dinner, something low-key and familiar to remind us all that we were still a family, that we still had roots worth saving, and I encouraged the idea, nodding gently when he brought it up, even offering to cook her favorite meal, chicken with rosemary, roasted carrots, and lemon rice, because I wanted everything to feel safe and ordinary, even as I set the pieces into place for what would become anything but ordinary. While they thought I was resting, I met once more with the investigator, this time in person, in the back corner of a quiet cafe where no one would recognize me, and together we reviewed the timeline, the documents, and the plan for what would unfold, each element carefully prepared, nothing left to chance. I had also spoken, quietly and confidentially, with someone else, a woman I hadn't seen in years, but who had once been my closest friend, a retired legal clerk who now spent her time volunteering at the library downtown, and who, after hearing what I was facing, didn't hesitate to offer her help, her knowledge, and most importantly, her credibility. It was she who helped me organize the materials into a binder that looked less like a confrontation and more like a presentation, the kind no reasonable person could ignore once they saw the pieces aligned. And so, on the evening Lauren returned, with the scent of rosemary filling the kitchen and the table set for 3, I placed that binder gently on the sideboard, out of sight but within easy reach, waiting not for a dramatic reveal, but for the perfect moment, the kind of moment that would speak louder than any accusation ever could. The dinner began politely, with Jacob smiling too much and Lauren speaking too little, her voice thinner than usual, her eyes avoiding mine in a way that told me she wasn't as confident as she used to be. And though she tried to fill the silences with light comments and practiced charm, I could see the unease flickering behind her words, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a drafty room. As we ate, I asked a few soft questions about her recovery, about how she'd been feeling, and when she answered, I nodded kindly, showing no sign of what I knew, no edge in my voice, just warmth and concern, and that, more than anything, seemed to make her uncomfortable, as if she wasn't sure how to respond to kindness from someone she had already written out of her life. And then, just as we cleared the dishes, I walked to the sideboard, picked up the binder, and placed it gently in front of Jacob, saying only that there were some things I had been meaning to share, some documents I had come across, a few conversations that had been recorded, and a set of photographs that I thought he ought to see. I didn't raise my voice, didn't look at Lauren, didn't even change the tone of my speech. I just placed it there and waited. He opened it slowly, flipping page after page, his eyes widening with each turn, the color draining from his face not with panic, but with the quiet devastation that comes when the foundation you've been standing on begins to crack. Lauren said nothing. She didn't protest, didn't lash out. She just sat there stiff and pale, her fork untouched on the napkin, as Jacob reached the final page and looked up at me, and in his face I saw 1,000 things: shock, grief, guilt, and finally, something I hadn't seen in weeks: clarity. And in that silence, I knew the trap had worked, not because someone had been caught, but because someone had finally seen. In the days that followed that quiet dinner, the atmosphere in the house shifted in a way that was hard to describe but impossible to ignore. Like the temperature had dropped by several degrees, even though the sun still shone through the windows, and the heater clicked on at all the right times, and though we all moved through the same familiar spaces, nothing felt the same. Not the hallway where I used to hear Emily's laughter echo in the mornings, not the kitchen where Lauren once hummed while slicing apples, and certainly not the dining room where the binder I had placed in front of Jacob had changed the course of everything. He didn't speak to me that night, not right away, only nodded faintly before standing and walking out to the backyard where he remained for nearly an hour, the porch light casting long shadows across the lawn as he sat motionless, holding that binder in his lap like a stone too heavy to set down. And when he finally returned, his face was quiet but resolute, and the next morning, before the coffee had even finished brewing, Lauren was gone.